As the old state system in the Middle East creaks under the weight of revolutions and rebellions, the flow of weapons to the area is increasing. Is the region entering a new form of militarisation? And what sort of new order will emerge from the barrel of the gun? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. After almost 4 years of revolutionary upheaval, armed groups hold sway in several countries across the Middle East and North Africa. Most have different ideologies and different sponsors, but they have a common source of strength: their weapons. As the old order in the region collapses, many of these so-called non-state actors have found that armed struggle, or at least the possession of weapons, helps them to achieve their goals. In Iraq, for example, an ineffective army has seen the rise of a number of powerful Shia groups. In Syria, a number of different armed groups continue to fight Bashar al-Assad's government. And, of course, both countries are trying to deal with one of the most powerful groups in the region, ISIL. 3 years after Muammar al-Gaddafi was removed from power, various militias continue to fight for control of Libya. And in Yemen, Houthi rebels effectively control the capital, Sana'a. But it's not just these non-state actors. Arab countries are buying more weapons than ever before. Military spending across the Middle East has risen by 56% over the last 10 years. Iraq saw the biggest rise over that period, an increase of 26% in its military spending. While Saudi Arabia, the biggest arms buyer in the Middle East, is now the 4th largest in the world. Let's bring in our guests to join the discussion now. We have joining us from Stockholm, Peter Weizimon, Senior Researcher of the CIPRI Arms and Military Expenditure Programme. In Beirut, Rami Khouri, Director of the Essam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. And in Oxford, Oliver Miles, former British Ambassador to Libya. Thank you all for joining us. If I could start with Mr. Peter Weizimon. Is the Middle East becoming an increasingly militarised neighbourhood when you look at the numbers?
I think when we look at the numbers, that's certainly the case. It's militarization all over the board. It's on the state level, as has been mentioned. We see states like Saudi Arabia, which spend very huge sums of money on buying the latest equipment. Saudi Arabia spends more than, for example, France or the UK. It spends an estimated 9% of its GDP on military expenditure. We also see it throughout society. You've mentioned Libya, you've mentioned Yemen. It's not just the states, it's also the rebels which find or which seek and find weapons to arm themselves.
So even non-state actors, Mr. Weizimon, just to be clear, non-state actors are becoming more armed, more militarized than before in the Middle East.
There were already before, of course, several armed groups in the Middle East, but I think with the events in Syria, with the events in Libya, for sure we see that there are even more than they used to be, and those are quite well armed. Many of them have been able to capture weapons from, in Libya, the former Gaddafi forces arsenals, and we see the same in Syria. The weapons that have been supplied to the region quite often end up in the hands of those rebel forces.
All right, Ambassador Miles, if you look at the situation there, the stats, as Mr. Weizimon pointed out, show more weapons coming into the region. Does this mean that perhaps more than in the past, if you're a tribe, if you're a group, a party looking for influence, it's going to be through the barrel of the gun that you'll be looking to exert that influence rather than through a political process?
Well, yes and no. I am horrified at the rise in the number and quality and size of arms in the Middle East, and I think Peter's account is enough to horrify anybody. But let's be realistic about this. When the first country I lived in the Middle East was Lebanon in 1960, and we knew that everybody had a gun under his bed, but we were a bit surprised when there was a village wedding and they were firing machine gun tracer bullets across the village. Weapons in the Middle East have been there since weapons have been invented, as a matter of fact. Yes, now there are more, they're more lethal, they cause more casualties, it's horrifying. But let's kid ourselves that they weren't there before, because they were.
They were there before, but are we not seeing examples of groups now trying to exert their power in areas where there was a history of a strong central government? The example of perhaps Shia militias, Badr Brigade in Iraq taking over territory, as well as Sunni groups. The example of new groups like Ajnad Misr, the soldiers of Egypt being announced in Cairo, launching attacks in Cairo, which has a long history of central government. Is that element not new, that we are seeing militarization of groups, of non-state actors who are not shying away of using those weapons, Ambassador Miles?
Well, it depends where you look. There's something in what you say, but I think one mustn't imagine that either that the Middle East was free of this kind of activity before, because it wasn't, nor, I think, do I see any big pattern of change now. I think a number of separate things have happened which have caused these events. To take first the historical point, I've already mentioned Lebanon. The militias in Lebanon have never been under the control of central government, never. The same is true in Yemen. When the British were in Yemen, and I served there myself in the days of Aden and all that, we never managed to control the tribes in Aden. They were armed. We controlled them to some extent. I think that the communist government, which came after the British period, the National Liberation Front government of when was it? Immediately after the British left, they may have done better than anyone else to create a central authority in Lebanon, but in Yemen. But it's never been done successfully. If you turn to the other countries you've mentioned, these are particular circumstances. Why do we see this chaos in Iraq? Because Iraq has just been invaded. Its strong central state structures have been destroyed. In their place, we see a government which is largely sectarian and therefore has lost the loyalty of most of the Sunni population of Iraq. I'm talking about the Maliki government now, which has gone. Maybe the new government will manage to do better. If you take Libya, Libya was systematically deprived of all its central state institutions by Gaddafi. So when the revolution came, the militias which fought it succeeded and found themselves in a political vacuum. These are special cases. This isn't a trend. If you look at Saudi Arabia, if you look at Egypt, you look at Algeria, look at the other countries in the Middle East, it hasn't happened there.
All right, perhaps a mixed bag, but nevertheless, Rami Khouri, even though Arab countries may have different dynamics going on, and there may be different reasons why we're seeing non-state actors rising in each country, is there not something of a generalization to extract from the different sort of dynamics which add up to the sum of more powerful non-state actors, even if the reasons are different?
Yes, I think there is a common thread that runs throughout the region, even in those countries which the ambassador correctly said are not falling apart, where you still have a strong central government. But you can trace this back to the 1970s, actually, and the beginning of a process then which turned later in the last decade into strong military non-state actors like the Mahdi army, like the Houthis in different countries. What started in the 70s is the central government was not able to maintain economic growth that kept up with population growth. Therefore, you started to have larger and larger pauperization, marginalization, and vulnerability among citizens. People became scared. The central government wasn't able to fulfill its role of security, opportunity, and growth and services. Therefore, the government started pulling out of some parts of societies. So in central Cairo, the Muslim Brothers were doing things. In rural Yemen, the tribes were doing things. In peri-urban Jordan, NGOs were providing medical care. Non-government actors filled in the gaps that the governments left behind.
But Mr. Khouri, we didn't see that develop into a challenge, an armed challenge to the government until, well, really, or intensify until the Arab Spring, did we?
No, you did. You had the challenges to governments in Syria, in Iraq. Major challenges were beaten down brutally. You had challenges in different countries that were fiercely beaten down, and that's why none of them succeeded, except the overthrow of Numeiri in Sudan in 1986, I think, was the only one where an uprising brought
All right, let me rephrase it. We
didn't
see it develop into a serious challenge to the authority of the central government in some of these countries until lately, correct? A successful challenge.
Well, yes and no. Again, you had people like Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestine and Lebanon grow as serious non-state armed actors who were stronger than the state in some cases. And each country is different, but the common thread is when the central government does not provide what the citizens expect from it, the citizens will get that from somewhere else, including identity, security, opportunity, and in some cases, people will just break away from the state, as they did, for instance, in southern Sudan, peacefully. So we have a problem with the interplay between sovereignty, territoriality, legitimacy, and identity in Arab countries. And in some countries, it's a bad problem, and you get this militarization of non-state actors or open warfare, as you have in Libya. In other countries, you just get political stress, as you have in Egypt and Morocco and Jordan to a lesser extent. But there is a common thread, which is the inability of the state to be an effective and, most importantly, fully legitimate state.
The very interesting factors you mentioned there, especially two of them, which I'm going to pick up on a little later, especially the idea of sovereignty and legitimacy. But before we do that, I want to turn once again to Mr. Vaizimon and say, where are the weapons coming from? Are they coming from inside the region? Are they coming from outside of the Middle East? Are they just weapons that have long been there in government stockpiles, which are being tapped locally? What's the source?
Well, I think it's very important to point out that most of the weapons in the Middle East have found their origin outside the region. It is other states which have supplied these weapons, often in large numbers, to the different regimes, the different governments in those countries. And then from there we see that either these governments collapse, such as in the case of Libya, or to a large extent in the case of Syria, and the weapons then kind of end up in the hands of a whole variety of rebel groups.
Okay, but do we know let's name some names. Where are the top, 5 or 10 or even 3 states where weapons are coming in? Are they known?
Yes, of course. The most important state which supplies arms to most countries in the region, to Saudi Arabia, to the other Gulf states, to Egypt, to Israel, is of course the United States, followed by countries like the UK, France, Germany, a number of European states. Russia also tries to play an important role there. They haven't really succeeded always. They have, of course, played an important role in the supply of weapons to Syria, also to Libya during the Gaddafi time. But I have to add to that it wasn't only the Russians there, but it was also European states which in that case chose to arm what they all knew was a dictator, up until the point that they figured out that he was a dictator and would use those weapons against the people in Libya, at which time they immediately imposed an arms embargo and started to bomb Gaddafi. But so it's a very broad group which supplies arms. There are very few states which are not willing to supply arms to a variety of states there. There are only very few states in the region, Iran and Syria, which hardly can get any arms, because there are only, in the case of Syria, it's only really Russia and China which wants to supply, and to some extent Iran, and Iran is under a United Nations arms embargo. But the other states, they can get their weapons almost wherever they want to. And then for them it's the trick, can they actually keep them under control? Can they keep their arsenal safe from the hands of opposition or rebel forces?
Ambassador Miles, do you see the current militarization trend that Mr. Vaizimon is talking about there? Is that an unintended consequence of haphazard policies which perhaps are focusing on micro issues, or is this an intended strategy for the region to be armed to the teeth, so to speak?
I don't think it's an intended strategy that they should be armed to the teeth. I think that the arms supplying countries, including my own, including Britain, but also including the other ones that Peter's mentioned, were tempted because they could get good money for these arms. And it's a relatively simple, straightforward way of earning back, especially from the oil-rich countries, large amounts of cash. I think that if there was a central strategy, that was it, not anything more thought out in terms of the region than that. I would just like to slightly shade what Peter has said. After all, he rather put Russia or the former Soviet Union, I would have said also, rather low in the scale. But let's forget that the weapon of choice in the Middle East for the last 40 years has been the Kalashnikov. The Kalashnikov is everywhere.
In terms of light arms? All right, let's bring in, if we could, Rami Khouri once again. Do you see the policy of sending weapons into the Middle East, that this is simply about getting some return on the oil cash? Surely there's some political goal involved here.
Of course, it's both. I mean, I remember back in the 70s when the oil prices went up sharply and there was a big international crisis. I mean, the oil producers loved it, but the oil importers had a big crisis, and they talked of recycling oil income, etc. So there was all kinds of ways to sell more things to the Arabs and the other oil producers and get the money back. But this is primarily a political gesture in some cases, and you have commercial deals, but the big arms supplies are basically linked to ideological agreements and people who agree with each other. So the Saudis will send arms to some of their friends. The Americans, the British, the French will send to their friends. They'll sell them or they'll give them. It doesn't make much difference in the end. What you're finding in the Middle East is the militarization of all of society. The state has become militarized because security agencies have been running most of these countries for the last 30, 40 years. So the state has been militarized, the opposition has been militarized, and foreign invading armies like the British and the American and the Iranians now are sending their troops in some places, and Russians are helping out in Syria, probably in other places.
And could we not add to that, Rami, as well, what we're seeing that even Middle Eastern states militarizing non-state actors in other countries. The news only today that Egypt is offering military assistance to a renegade general in Libya. Is that not evidence of Middle Eastern states themselves turning to non-state actors within the region to further their goals?
Well, absolutely. And one of the most fascinating things happening right now is the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and a few others here and there, not only sending money or sending arms to people they like around the region, but actually themselves fighting. And I mean, the UAE and Qatar were involved in Libya, and they've now been, Saudis and others and them are fighting in Syria. So the fact that Gulf countries are fighting in other countries directly is a fascinating and important new development. It may have negative implications. It may turn out to be something healthy. We just don't know. It's too early to tell, but it certainly is novel. And this is a trend now where people all over the region basically ignore the borders, and they do whatever they want, anywhere they want, with money, with guns, with military attacks, with migrants. So this is a real problem. And this is where I'm talking about the problem of sovereignties fraying in many parts of the region until the people themselves reconfigure and revalidate their own countries, because most of these countries were not created by their own people. Now, they may stay like they are. It doesn't mean every country is going to change. Sudan changed, but maybe they'll all stay like they are. We don't know. But they have to be validated by their own people, and that's the really critical process that we're waiting for. And only that will provide the legitimacy and the stability which will let the arms go back to the army and have a normal society.
Ambassador Miles, where do you think this is ultimately leading to? If you look at some of the words we're hearing on this show from Rami just a few seconds ago there, that people are ignoring borders, fraying of sovereignty. Are we heading towards chaos or a new order in the Middle East ultimately?
Let me add to what Rami said, and I agree with most of it, that it's not quite so new for Arab states to be involved in these conflicts, because the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, 1991, several of the Arab states took part in and financed the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. Coming to your broader question, I I'm one of those who don't see a clear pattern in this. I don't see some movement or new tendency. I think that you're right to fear a descent into chaos, but it won't be a central, a universal descent into chaos. The problem of chaos is in those parts of the Arab world where there is no real government. Libya is one example. Iraq is a much worse example. Iraq and Syria now, or the so-called Islamic Republic, Islamic State, that is a significant problem which may lead to chaos in the surrounding countries, but it's not part of a general pattern, I don't think.
All right, Mr. Vezimon, briefly, some talk about the need for an embargo. Do embargoes work? Do they help to cut down the flow of weapons or cut down some legitimate flow of weapons and increase others which are not very legitimate?
It depends a bit on who the embargo is aimed at. When it's aimed at the state, for example, in the case of Iran, it's very clear that Iran is not able to acquire the same type of high-tech, modern, advanced major weapons such as other states, particularly the Arab states in the region can. When it's aimed at rebels, it is often more symbolic in the sense that there are usually already kind of arms embargoes on the rebels. Though if we would look at the case of Syria, if the world would have agreed on an arms embargo on Syria, it certainly would have helped to stop the flows of arms to the regime, and potentially, and that depends very much again on how states will behave, would also have changed the flow of weapons to rebel forces. Though one has to say, of course, that even if there would have been an embargo, there were already so many weapons there that just on the basis of that, a war could be maintained for a pretty long time, as we have also seen in other cases where arms embargoes have been imposed elsewhere in the world.
All right, and Rami, on a thought which you mentioned earlier, I wonder whether you think this region is now in a sort of vicious circle, in a struggle between power sovereignty on the one hand and on the other hand the concept of legitimacy. The more that people in places like Egypt or Yemen or Libya or Syria see their current political processes as illegitimate, the more that they might take up arms, the more that those holding on to power, on the other hand, will respond with the use of arms, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's probably accurate to say that most of the Arab governments have never been fully legitimized by their own people. They were legitimized by having a seat at the UN, by having an American or French or British ambassador there, but they were never fully legitimized by their own people. And I think this is part of the chaos that we're seeing now, the upheaval. As central governments collapse in some places or just retreat in other places, groups take their place. There's armed groups, there's civilians who are demonstrating, there's opposition groups who are funded from abroad. There's all kinds of, and wars and fighting and terrorism and new things like the Islamic State. We're really in a situation of chaos that will, in some parts of the region,
why is that? Why has there never been? I mean, there was a point, forgive me for interrupting, where it seemed like there was an uprising in the Arab world, an Arab Spring, a push to create a more legitimate political order. Was there a countering fear amongst governments in the region, governments outside of the region, that a stable, democratic Middle East might be ruled by forces that the current regimes in the Middle East and the governments outside the Middle East are worried, are in fear of?
Well, I mean, that's a really important question, which probably needs a whole separate show. But the revolutions that happened were democratic, civil, and peaceful for the most part. They didn't work, except maybe Tunisia, because there was tremendous counter-revolutionary forces. And there was a process of transition that just never had a chance to really happen. Fear took over, and we have the situations that we have now, either warfare in Libya and chaos, or the return of the army in Egypt, or the tensions in Libya and Yemen and Bahrain. So that process is going to take a lot longer for peaceful democratic transformation, which is what most people would like to have, but they have to define it in their own terms. So I think we have to accept that the situation is going to be, for instance, what you have in Egypt is probably going to be pretty typical of what you have in the region until an evolutionary process can take hold. And there has to be, big issues have to be solved. Do you have a balance between religiosity and secularism, between military rule, civilian rule? These issues can only be decided by the people through some kind of participatory process. And that hasn't happened except in Tunisia now. And maybe we'll see it happening in other Arab countries, but not yet. So the forces of autocracy, the military rule, which is supported by Western and other countries, are too strong right now to be shaken. And this is one of the problems, because those forces are what created the corruption and the mismanagement and the disequilibrium, the poverty, the fear, and ultimately the kinds of wars and situations that allowed, the chaos that allowed groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State to rise. So it's a terrible, vicious cycle.
You're right about one thing. We probably do need another show to get deeper into this, but we'll leave that for another day. Let's thank our guests very much for joining us, Mr. Peter Vezimon, Ambassador Oliver Miles, and Mr. Rami Khouri. And thank you too for watching. Do feel free to add your voice to the discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. From me and all the team, it's goodbye for now.